Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the Journeyman podcast. We're on episode 18 now, and we're going to be diving into something that I think, maybe you've thought about before, this idea of intelligence and how that relates to your social life and maybe even solitude. So if you're enjoying these journeys with us, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future episodes.
We've got a great expert with us today who is going to help us unpack all of these different sources we have articles, excerpts, even a whole YouTube video breakdown.
Wow, that's quite a collection.
Yeah, so have you ever felt like you just don't fit in? Like you see the world a little differently than those around you? That's what we're kind of exploring today. And one philosopher who had some pretty interesting things to say about this was this guy, Arthur Schopenhauer.
Oh yeah, Schopenhauer. He's definitely got some strong opinions.
Yeah, so yeah, what was he saying about this whole idea of intelligence and maybe not fitting in? Well, he had this idea that a lot of social interaction is actually a kind of performance. We're constantly trying to fit in to gain approval, and then we end up participating in what he called the farce of social life.
The farce. Okay, I could definitely see that. Like, laughing at jokes you don't really find funny or just making small talk that feels totally pointless. But why was he calling it a farce? Like, why did he think that was a bad thing?
He believed that this need for validation, that this fear of rejection, it stops us from forming genuine connections. We're so busy playing a role that society expects us to play that we kind of lose sight of who we really are.
Okay, so it's like we're all wearing masks, putting on a show instead of just being ourselves. And again, the more intelligent you are, maybe the more aware you become of this whole performance thing.
Exactly. And that's where things can get a little tricky because when you start to see through the farce, you recognize how superficial a lot of interactions are, and it's tough to keep playing along. You start to feel like an outsider, like you don't really belong.
Right. So it's not that intelligent people are like antisocial. It's more like they see the game that's being played, and they're not always comfortable participating.
You got it. One of the articles we read actually described it as seeing the lies disguised as courtesy in everyday life.
Wow.
And that can be a pretty isolating experience.
Yeah. It's like being in a room where everyone's raving about this song that you secretly think is terrible. Everyone's singing along, dancing, and you just can't bring yourself to pretend to enjoy it.
That's perfect. It's like you're not against music. You're not against people having fun. You just can't genuinely participate in something that feels inauthentic.
Right. And that can leave you feeling kind of alienated.
Definitely.
But it's not all doom and gloom, though, right? I mean, the sources we've looked at seem to suggest that there's another side to this, a more positive way to view this whole feeling of not fitting in.
Absolutely. And that's where this idea of solitude comes in.
Solitude. Okay.
Schopenhauer believed that solitude, the real kind, it's a choice. It's about consciously stepping away from all the noise and distractions and connecting with yourself, thinking deeply, and tapping into your inner world.
So it's not about like becoming a hermit and rejecting all social contact. It's more about choosing to spend time alone in a way that nourishes your mind and your spirit.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer wasn't alone in this belief. Think about figures like Da Vinci Nature, even Tesla. They all spent a lot of time in solitude, and it really fueled their genius.
Wow. I never really thought about solitude like that as a source of strength and creativity.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And it's so often misunderstood. People confuse solitude with loneliness, but they're completely different. Loneliness is negative. It's isolation. It's a lack of connection. But solitude, it's about consciously choosing to be with yourself. And in doing so, you discover a whole world of possibilities.
So
It's like
go on.
it's like the difference between being alone in a prison cell and choosing to spend a weekend at a peaceful retreat.
Okay. Yeah.
One is forced isolation, the other is a deliberate step back to reconnect with yourself.
I love that analogy. And I think it speaks to something really important. Solitude isn't something to be feared. It's something to be embraced.
Can agree more. Yeah, and Schopenhauer was really onto something, especially when you think about the world we live in today. We're constantly bombarded with information, notifications, demands on our attention.
It's true.
It's no wonder that so many people feel stressed and overwhelmed these days.
Yeah, like we're expected to be on all the time, connected to everyone and everything.
Right.
But what about just needing to disconnect? Be quiet, think your own thoughts.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer believed that silence was absolutely crucial for deep thinking, for creativity, for self-discovery.
Hmm.
In fact, one of your sources even suggested that society kind of uses noise and distraction to keep us from really questioning things.
Wow, that's interesting. So by choosing solitude, by embracing silence, we're actually taking back control of our own minds.
Yes, exactly. And it doesn't have to be this big, grand, sweeping gesture. You don't have to go live in a cave to benefit from solitude. It can be as simple as taking 15 minutes every morning to sit in silence, to meditate, to just be present with your own thoughts and feelings.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that Da Vinci, Nietzsche, and Tesla all spent time in solitude. I'm curious, what were the benefits that they experienced?
Oh, that's a great question. Da Vinci, for example, he was known to spend hours just wandering alone in nature, observing the world around him.
Hmm.
And those solitary walks, they fueled his imagination, and they inspired so many of his inventions and artistic masterpieces.
Wow. So it's not just about being alone. It's about using that time to actively engage with your inner world, to observe, to reflect.
Exactly. And Nietzsche, on the other hand, he found that solitude gave him the space he needed to develop his philosophical ideas. He famously wrote that one must be a sea to receive a polluted stream without becoming impure.
Wow, I like that.
Meaning, he needed that time alone to process his thoughts and to stay true to his own convictions.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about Tesla? How did solitude play a role in his work?
Well, Tesla was famously eccentric and spent a lot of time alone in his laboratory. And it was during those solitary hours that he made some of his most groundbreaking discoveries in the field of electricity.
That's pretty amazing.
He once said, "Be alone, that is the secret of invention. Be alone, that is when ideas are born."
It seems like there's a common thread here. Solitude allows us to tap into a level of creativity and insight that you just can't get when you're constantly surrounded by people and distractions.
You're absolutely right. And here's the really interesting part. When you're comfortable with your own thoughts, when you no longer need that constant external validation, you become more authentic, more genuine. And paradoxically, that makes you more magnetic to others.
Hmm. That is fascinating. Why do you think that is?
Well, because authenticity is rare. In a world where everyone's trying to fit in, to project a certain image, to gain likes and followers, genuine self-expression, it becomes incredibly attractive.
So it's not about rejecting connection altogether. It's more about being selective, choosing to connect with people who appreciate you for who you truly are.
Precisely. It's about building relationships based on genuine affinity, not just on a need to belong.
That's a good distinction. This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about seeing through the farce of social interaction. When you're comfortable in your own skin, when you're not constantly seeking approval, you're less likely to participate in those superficial interactions.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of strategic engagement comes in. Think of it like a chess game. You don't just make random moves, you think carefully about each move, about the consequences, about the long-term strategy.
Okay, so with social interaction, it's not about withdrawing from the world entirely. It's more about choosing when to engage, when to contribute, when to step back and recharge.
You got it.
Hmm.
And that's a really powerful concept because it means you're no longer reacting to external pressures, but acting from a place of intention and purpose.
I'm starting to see how all of these ideas, intelligence, solitude, authenticity, strategic engagement, they all weave together to create this really compelling way of approaching life. It's not about fitting in, it's about standing out, not about seeking validation, but about expressing your own unique gifts and talents.
That's exactly it. It's about recognizing that your unique perspective, your individual way of seeing the world, is valuable. And sometimes the best way to nurture that perspective is to spend time in solitude, to cultivate silence, and to allow your own inner voice to guide you.
Wow, this conversation has really got me thinking differently about, my social life and my alone time.
Yeah, it's amazing how a shift in perspective can really change how we see the world and our place in it.
So if we had to kind of sum up everything we talked about today into a key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I think the biggest takeaway is to really embrace your individuality. If you've ever felt like you don't fit in, like you see the world a little differently, that's not a weakness, it's a strength.
It's like that quote, the one who follows the crowd will usually get no further than the crowd. The person who walks alone is likely to find themselves in places no one has ever been.
Exactly. And Schopenhauer believed that true intelligence, it's not just about book smarts or test scores. It's about having the courage to think for yourself, to challenge the status quo, to forge your own path.
And that path might lead you to spend more time in solitude, to embrace silence, to really cultivate your inner world.
Absolutely, but it's not about isolating yourself completely. It's about finding that balance, between connecting with others and nurturing your own individuality.
It's about choosing your battles, right? Engaging with the world in a way that feels authentic and meaningful, and knowing them to step back and recharge.
You got it.
That's good.
And it's fascinating to think that by embracing solitude, by becoming comfortable with our own company, we might actually become more magnetic to the right people.
Yeah, it's like we were saying earlier. Authenticity is rare and refreshing in a world that often feels obsessed with conformity.
Exactly. So if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this conversation, it's don't be afraid to be yourself. Embrace your quirks, your unique perspective, your moments of solitude. Those are the things that make you special.
That's a great message to end on. And remember, everyone's solitude isn't a punishment. It's a gift. It's a chance to connect with your inner world, to tap into your creativity, to recharge, and come back to the world feeling refreshed and inspired.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners have too.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the connection between intelligence, social life, and solitude, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the Journeyman podcast for more thought-provoking explorations. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep journeying.